They were assaulted almost instantly. Mantids wielding elongated spears pierced 2 of the first 3 men at the entrance, nearly striking Reeve as well. He narrowly deflected the attack in time and succeeded in entering the mantid's defense. The mantid fell as his sword penetrated its thorax, and then the rush of adrenaline returned as the next alien approached him. Reeve slashed and stabbed his way through them until, all of a sudden, there were no more mantids. No more living ones, at least. As it turned out, that was the simpler part. 3 tunnels extended from the expansive entrance chamber, with additional tunnels branching off from them. There was no indication of more mantids, but the tower was vast, and they had no means of determining the direction of their target. Steiner had no option but to divide them into squads at this point. By the time they reached the 3rd branch, Reeve found himself accompanied by just 3 other individuals. Remarkably, he actually recognized one of them. Tom Wyatt had trained alongside him at the same facility. They had spent considerable time together and had become quite familiar with one another. Wyatt was also a former DJ, specifically a displaced juvenile. He had lost both parents during the assault on Chicago. A few weeks into their training, he and Reeve discovered that they had both passed through the same processing center in Ohio and had even attended the same school for a few months, although Wyatt was a few years older, which had prevented them from ever conversing. The other 2 were Farkas and Yamada. He had encountered Farkas previously, but only in a casual manner. Yamada had completed his training at the center in Seoul and likely had never been in the same hemisphere as Reeve. Farkas, hailing from Europe, was proficient in English, which was a skill Yamada lacked. However, Reeve appreciated Yamada's swordsmanship during their confrontation at the entrance, making him glad to have him on the team. The Japanese were among the few cultures that maintained a tradition of sword fighting, and they exhibited a strong sense of motivation. Nearly every significant city in Japan had been devastated by mounted raiding parties. It was likely that much of the material used for constructing this tower was sourced from cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Sapporo. Through the visor of his helmet, Reeve noticed a prominent scar on Yamada's face, extending from his left eyebrow to the right corner of his lip, crossing over his nose. It appeared to be an old injury. Reeve nearly inquired if the scar was a memento from the mantids, but he decided against it, recognizing that the moment was not appropriate. If they managed to escape this situation, he thought he might treat Yamada to a drink later. The tunnels were constructed from the same pitch-black material as the tower's outer surface, yet the illumination was a soft blue, reminiscent of the luminescence of the mantid's home star. Reeve guided his team through tunnel after tunnel, diligently marking junctions on their map. They maintained radio communication with the rest of their unit, but had lost contact with both the army and the fleet, which was concerning. The tower could be obstructing their signals, but it also raised the possibility that the army's signal relays had been compromised. As they ventured deeper into the tower, Reeve had no plan other than to choose the largest tunnel that directed them towards the tower's center. They encountered dead ends twice, confirmed by a swift jab of their swords, necessitating a retreat. Reeve pondered whether the architecture served a practical function comprehensible only to mantids, or if it was intentionally crafted to be perplexing. On 2 additional occasions, they encountered patrols of armed mantids. The first group appeared to be searching for them. 10 mantids emerged from a side tunnel, nearly decapitating Farkas, before Yamada skillfully severed the first assailant from shoulder to hip, or more accurately, from the arm joint to the point where the abdomen met the thorax. The narrowness of the tunnel was the only factor that prevented them from being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Reeve himself took down 3, impaling a first, delivering a hasty chop to the second's abdomen, and then regaining his composure to deftly deflect the last one's sword by catching its barbs. He executed the final blow by slicing his sword across its neck. The second patrol appeared even more astonished by the humans than the humans were by them. They were dispatched within mere seconds, allowing Reeve and his team to continue on their path. Soon after, they encountered unarmed mantids, presenting Reeve with a dilemma he had never contemplated before. Every mantid he had ever encountered or heard of had been armed. These 5 were not clad in armor, nor did they possess weapons. Their jerky movements as they retreated made it clear that they were frightened. Wyatt inquired about what they should do with them. Given Yamada's aggressive approach, it seemed he did not consider it a question, yet Farkas also hesitated. Ultimately, it was Reeve who provided the answer. They were unable to permit them to disclose their location. Moments later, 5 mantid corpses were sprawled on the tunnel floor. Reeve found himself compelled to pause for a closer examination. He had never encountered a mantid without its armor, aside from the autopsy images in the intelligence briefings. At first glance, they indeed resembled a praying mantis. Not precisely, but sufficiently similar. They possessed 6 legs, each with 4 joints. Their abdomen was relatively short and coiled upwards, instead of trailing behind them like certain species of orchid mantis. They stood nearly upright on 4 legs, with small claws at the tips. However, there were distinctions. Rather than having serrated forelimbs, they featured robust arms that culminated in finely articulated claws capable of grasping and manipulating objects. The manner in which they were jointed and held against their bodies, with claws pointing downward, was reminiscent of a mantis. They lacked feelers or antennae on their heads, and their mouthparts opened to reveal a mouth akin to a sea anemone, surrounded by a ring of tentacles encircling a sphincter. The compound eyes located on the sides of their heads did not provide stereoscopic vision. They depended on the 2 pairs of eyes situated in the center of their heads for that function. They bore such a striking resemblance to the praying mantis from Earth that when they initially dispatched their raiding teams down from their ships, most individuals assumed there must be some connection. It was only years later, when humans finally succeeded in killing the first of them, that dissection revealed their internal structure bore no similarity. Even their cells were markedly different from Earth organisms, to the extent that they lacked DNA altogether. Evolution had favored 6 legs, 3 segments, and an exoskeleton in 2 entirely distinct solar systems simply because it was effective. Reeve had always been curious about their thoughts upon arriving on Earth and discovering miniature versions of themselves prowling across the leaves and flower petals. Despite their apparent focus on gathering the essential resources to construct this tower, it was entirely possible that they remained oblivious to their surroundings. He had also contemplated whether humans would have been treated differently by the aliens had they resembled a praying mantis more closely. The tunnels were undoubtedly leading inward. Reeves still could not discern any structural logic to them, yet they were certainly progressing toward the center. Some squads reported being hindered by an ever-increasing number of mantids, while others had not encountered any at all. Steiner was recalling some of them to bolster those facing the most resistance, based on the assumption that the mantids were guarding these paths because they led to a significant location. Nevertheless, he still wished to investigate as many routes as possible. Thus, Reeve and his squad continued onward. The first indication that Reeve had of another attack was when something emerged from the darkness, splattering blood and other remnants of Wyatt across his shield. An arc rifle discharged directly down the tunnel. They were fortunate that it had only claimed one of their lives. Reeve pressed himself against the wall, then noticed a side tunnel just ahead. He, Farkas, and Yamada reached it just as the arc rifle fired once more. The shot passed so closely that it sent ripples of energy across Yamada's shield. Breathing heavily, Reeve took a moment to compose himself before peering down the tunnel. He was barely able to spot the shooter, approximately 20 meters ahead at the upcoming junction. He quickly jerked his head back, anticipating that it would be shot off if he did not. However, the shooter was not going to expend another anti-field round until he had a clear opportunity. He glanced down the side tunnel, which appeared to curve towards the center as well. Yet, it was impossible to determine how long the route would take or what they might encounter along it. He took another look towards the shooter. There was another side tunnel about 5 meters ahead on the opposite side. Someone might be able to reach it if they acted swiftly. Reeve promptly devised a plan with his 2 remaining squad mates. Farkas and Yamada would investigate where the side tunnel led and attempt to flank the shooter. While Reeve maintained the mantid's focus, he allotted them approximately 30 seconds, then took a running start and dashed towards the next side tunnel. The reflexes of the mantid were slower than those of humans, but not by much. The anti-field round came so close to him that Reeve was convinced it had struck him for a brief moment. He landed heavily in the next side tunnel and was astonished to discover that he still had all his limbs intact. There was no way he could escape that again. However, he was at least certain he had captured the shooter's attention. He peeked out once, then twice, just to confirm that the shooter was still present. In fact, it was not only the shooter, but at least 3 other mantids were lurking just behind the corner, remaining out of sight. A minute went by, followed by another. Then Farkas initiated a communication line to inform him that they had reached a dead end and were returning. Perfect. Reeve was nearly hyperventilating at this point. He sensed they were close. However, if the mantids at the tunnel's end decided to charge at him, he doubted he had the strength left to fend them all off. Fortunately, they were either unaware of this or preferred their current position. They possessed a ranged weapon while he did not. The only way he could reach the end of that corridor was if the mantid fired it. He could likely make it before the mantid had a chance to reload. But naturally, he wouldn't be able to do much good if he ended up in several pieces. Then he discovered the solution. He communicated it to Farkas and Yamada, and they concurred. They would draw the mantid's fire while he, being closer, would make a sprint for the corridor's end while the shooter reloaded. It wasn't an ideal plan, but since he had devised it, there was a reasonable chance that the others would succeed as well. He simply had to trust that he could survive long enough for Yamada and Farkas to catch up. They would only be seconds behind him. 5 mantids, including the shooter, who was now discarding his weapon and drawing his arc saber. Reeves screamed, propelled by pure rage and adrenaline at this point. He didn't merely parry, he forcefully struck down the first sword that approached him and impaled its wielder directly through the face. Then he struck the next adversary aside and body-checked another against the wall before pivoting and slicing his sword downward, resulting in the alien collapsing as its 2 right legs were severed completely. He concluded that one with a thrust through the thorax, then had to duck as another sword narrowly missed, nearly decapitating him. 2 down, yet he was quickly exhausting. He leaped up and attempted to grapple with the closest one, believing its companions would avoid hitting it, but that was easier said than done, with their shields slipping and sliding against one another. He pushed it forcefully enough that it collided with the wall, then disarmed another attempting to stab him by hooking the barbs of the sword again. He sensed more than saw the one on his left swing at his head and ducked down while swinging around blindly. Something made contact, although he was uncertain with what, but there was no follow-up attack. He seized the moment's respite to gut the mantid he had disarmed, which had foolishly lunged forward to retrieve its sword. Then the mantid he had pushed into the wall returned the favor and slammed into him, knocking him off his feet. His sword went spinning away, and suddenly Reeve found himself on the ground, gazing up at a mantid that had its sword raised, poised to strike. He attempted to rise, but he had nothing left. The fatigue felt like barbed hooks digging into him, dragging him down to the floor. The mantid brought its sword down, only to discover that its arm had been severed at the joint by Yamada, who stepped past Reeve and cleanly decapitated the mantid. Yamada extended his arm and assisted Reeve to his feet. Reeve didn't even need to inquire about Farkas. The way Yamada continued down the tunnel indicated to him that it was just the two of them now. A pity. Reeve had met the Hungarian at an airbase in southern England just before they ascended into orbit. They had only exchanged a few words while waiting for their assignments, but he would have liked to know him better. He had entertained that thought too many times throughout his life.